a big theme. We'll start with a theme that runs through this book and probably both of their lives, is telling people things they don't want to hear. So we'll maybe just ping pong between you two, or we'll see what happens. But Catherine, your book, can you tell us a little bit about that? What are the challenges with telling people things they don't want to hear?
I would reframe that, because I came from the position of hearing the calls of people like Rob Nixon in Slow Violence and Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, saying that, writers need to figure out ways to address the climate crisis. Like, this is the existential emergency of our generation, of our planetary world. And so I didn't start it from a perspective of a position of feeling, that it was negative, more that it was necessary and urgent. And I felt a desire to tell a story that engaged with climate science in some way. And I wanted, I guess, to put a climate scientist in a novel and write about climate science, which was its own challenge. And I've always been really interested, as Elizabeth knows, in putting science in novels and scientists in novels. I mean, I've written about neurology and migraines, and there was an astronaut in my first novel. So that specific challenge. So yeah, I'll just start there.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think to start, like Catherine, I think the conversation is so important that there's no point in putting our heads in the sand, that we need to be talking about this. And there's a real urgency to talking about it now, because we really have so little time to turn the situation around and to deal with the emergency and to reduce the emissions that are causing climate change. So I think in my career, there have been times in the past where there hasn't really been the same appetite for a conversation about climate change in Canada. So it's been really exciting these last few years to be operating in a political climate and a public climate where people are really open and wanting more information about climate change. And so, I'm actually not a research scientist. I'm a climate scientist is a good sort of general term, but I actually work at sort of the interface of science and policy. So my job is always about trying to explain climate change to other people. And so, telling people information is never going to be the answer to getting them to be, motivated to do something. You have to find all kinds of ways to get people really motivated to do things. And I think that storytelling is a really important part of it, and that novels like Catherine's and other works of fiction that tell the story of climate change and the threat of climate change in different ways are really a way to broaden the public conversation about it.
Yeah, and I would just, go on and say that, I wanted to tell a story that was engaging and dramatic, and, Blaze Island takes the Tempest as its undertext, and there, it starts in this huge hurricane, and follows particularly these young characters, Miranda, who's the climate scientist's daughter, and Caleb, who's the Caliban figure, on the island. And, it follows the play quite closely, and this airline magnate is lured to the island by Miranda's climate scientist father with a promise of a climate engineering experiment that he thinks he'll be able to invest in. And so, there is the emergency and the sort of terror of the climate getting worse behind the events of the story, but I didn't want to write something that was dystopic and negative. And I also wanted to try and write something that was rooted in a kind of literary realism, at the same time as it took some quite outlandish science and put it in this fairly realistic milieu. And, we can talk a little more at some point just about the climate engineering side of the novel.
So the collaboration, maybe talk to me a little bit about.
It sounds a bit of an exaggeration. Listen, it's all Catherine.
Yeah, but you were a useful sounding point. I would certainly, from early on. I mean, I feel like, well, if we go back, I mean, I was thinking, back to our really early days and how we were brought up. I mean, our father was a doctor. I mean, he was the last sole head of the Princess Margaret Hospital, but both our parents were very interested in nature and took us out hiking, and we grew up with that kind of relationship to the world. And I've always, maybe more than Elizabeth, and I would be interested in hearing her point of view on this, but I've always felt from being a teenager, just the ecological peril of the world. I mean, even from the time in the 70s, the late 70s, and that was, so I feel like I internalized that fairly early. And I don't know if Elizabeth did as well. I'm kind of curious about that. Actually, I don't know if I've ever asked you that.
Well, it's a bit of a diversion from talking about the novel, but I think, absolutely. I think those early childhood experiences in nature, and not only did our parents make an effort to get us out, for walks on the weekend in nature, we also grew up in these townhouses that were on a valley, and we spent a lot of our time, as children did then at the time, roaming around in the woods and, playing freely and climbing trees and, just mucking about. And I think that those were very, informative kind of ways to spend our younger years. And then, I went through a period where I was probably not out in nature as much until partway through university. I felt this intense longing that there was something missing from my life. And then I started working summers at research stations for biology profs that I worked for. And I think it was, again, that deep sense that I needed that in my life, to be immersed in nature at least part of the time.
When I think about the origins of Blaze Island, I do think about Elizabeth, and she can't probably go into detail, but I mean, she was part of Canada's delegations on the International Panel of Climate Change conferences, and I guess that just gave me some sense of the ethical complexity of relationships between North and South, and I just began to think more, about how people who have to deal with climate change all the time are holding all these complex emotions, holding all this grief and fear and anger. And what would that like to be a climate scientist and, who has to hold all this emotion, while communicating with the world through data and trying to parent. And so that, evolved into the character of Millen Wells in the novel. And I was always interested in the climate engineering aspect, and because it seemed so impossible and wild that people were thinking about, say, shooting particulate matter into the outer atmosphere to create a haze that will block sunlight to stop global heating, but it doesn't stop the rise of carbon or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And it seemed so outlandish, but the fact that people were, scientists were, reasonable scientists were frightened enough of what was coming that they were pursuing these lines of research. I wasn't going to advocate for them in the novel, but I really wanted to explore that as an ethical realm through a scientist who was lured by this. And so we went together. I think, Elizabeth, you told me about the climate, and I'm sure you told me about the climate engineering conference in Berlin. Yeah.
Okay, I feel like my brain is going in different directions, because I also wanted to say what I remember as one of the early things that sparked the novel, I thought, was also the so-called climate gate. That I forget exactly when it happened now.
2009.
2009, and that was really kind of an awakening for the climate science community, because, they really thrust climate science. So ClimateGate was this hacking of the emails of some research scientists at the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. And then, of course, those hacked emails were revealed to the public. And of course, they were taken out of context by climate deniers who were trying to misrepresent what the scientists were saying. And it really thrust those climate scientists who were involved in this into the limelight in a way that they were, completely unprepared for. So for the most part, while there may be some scientists that love the limelight and have really, interacted with the media on a regular basis, probably it's not untrue to say that the vast majority of scientists are quite comfortable being in their little, their own little world and doing their research. And they were, wholly unprepared for the kind of negative spotlight that was on them and the way that their work was misrepresented. And I think, and it had really serious personal, negative personal impacts on those involved. And I think that also was something that Catherine and I talked about. And obviously, she tries to weave that into the story in the character of Milan, because he goes through something similar. And it's that, that frustration with the inability to just do your work and to have to constantly do battle with the climate deniers that eventually leads him. Well, there's more to the story. I don't know how much you'd like to give away.
Like all fiction writers, I think what I want to do is offer people the opportunity to re-see the world and not only grapple with the issues of climate science and climate grief and climate engineering, but also to reconnect readers with the natural world in an embodied way. And so this novel is full of the elements. And
Yeah.
I know, in fact, Elizabeth was very fond of an earlier title of the novel, which which was elemental, which really sort of emphasized that side of this world, because, the characters are immersed in wind. They live on a fictionalized version of Fogo Island, where, as one of my Fogo Island friends says, wind decides everything. And I wanted to amplify all those elements and sort of bring the human story down a level. So it was decentered, and that was also very important. And it goes on being really important to my writing practice these days.
Why is that, do you think?
Because I think it's really essential to our survival. That we, the humans should not be at the center of the story. We're one life form in this complex biosphere. And if we're going to survive as a biosphere, which is what we need, we can't survive without the rest of the living biosphere. And so, we have to sort of broaden our sense of kinship and care across the human world to embrace strangers, but also into the more than human world and embrace, all other forms of life on a living planet. So I don't really like to bring any kind of agenda to being a fiction writer. Other than that, I feel that I would desire people to feel in a heightened way and re-see the world. That's what art does. But I really do want to write from that place of care and attention to the world beyond the human.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of great questions that arise from the book, like nobody's doing anything, right? That's the angst from Milan.
I want to say something.
Yeah.
Raise my hand. Well, just to be provocative then, so that we're not always agreeing throughout this whole interview. No, I absolutely agree with Catherine, and I feel the same way, that I think that part of what this climate emergency or climate change has really taught us is that we have to rethink the relationship we have that nature, that the fact that humans are influencing the globe on a planetary scale, and that the impact of the carbon pollution that we're putting in the atmosphere now will last for thousands, tens of thousands of years. That the fact that we have that kind of an impact, I think, shows that we need to fundamentally change the way that we interact with nature, and the other part of it is, of course, is that climate change is an exacerbating factor in terms of driving species loss. So for somebody who came up from biology as an initial discipline, that was actually my hook into climate change originally, was the fact that, that other impacts are horrible, but we may be able to adapt to them. But when a species is gone, of course, it's gone, and extinction is so final. And so to me, it's a level of devastation that I think is hard to match in other impacts. But the provocative bit that I wanted to say is that while I think that there are many people that respond to the need for a new ethos around how we live in the world and how we interact with nature, when you talk to people about climate change, that particular narrative is not always one that resonates, and it really depends on who you're talking to. So while there are some people that understand and are willing to think about a whole scale change in the way that, we live our lives, there are certainly, many ways to talk about climate change. And I think part of what we all have to do is find ways to talk to people. So for people that are, not environmentalists, who don't particularly want to spend a lot of time in nature, trying to get them on board with taking action on climate change, one thing that can work is just, the sort of narrative around galvanizing human ingenuity and innovation and the sort of collective action that we need to solve this problem, in the kind of sense that we rally people to solve, to sort of for war efforts or to, for space programs or things on that kind of scale that we could tap into that. Or talk about, the co-benefits that come with reducing our consumption and burning of fossil fuels in terms of clean air and in terms of using nature to help suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere. People will have, that's a climate change action, but it will also provide better wild spaces for people. So there are lots of different ways to talk about climate change. And so that's just what I wanted to say, that I know when talking to some people, talking to them about, I don't know how to put it, but just that I have to think about jobs and I have to talk to them about, things that matter to them. Finding common values, I guess, is what you have to find.
And I think that you just as a person have more, faith in the power of human ingenuity maybe than I do. I think maybe I'm just a little more, I don't know, cynical or an eco-activist or something. And, but I completely see your point about the need for those kind of narratives, especially, in figuring out a range of public narratives that speak to a diversity of people.
Catherine's level of research really surprised me, and that there was actually very little to correct. It's filled with detail, not only about what it's like to be an Arctic scientist and what, different words for snow and what the ice and snow sound like and feel like. I mean, these are things.
You know what?
Oh yeah,
you introduced me to the Arctic scientist Chris Dirksen, who I took out for a drink in a snowstorm and took copious notes from. So that's how it works.
It engages the reader in thinking about climate change while also telling, there's a compelling mystery behind it. There's a complicated relationship between the father and daughter, and there's a love story. And I think those things, and there's also the elements of the land and all that. There's a lot of work that Catherine had to do to sort of personify, the story of climate change, because it can be such a big story. And I think that it was surprising to me how successful she was in being able to write about it in a way that was so personal. And in fact, a friend of mine who's reading the novel, she said that as well. She said, wow, one of the biggest challenges is talking about climate change in a way, to bring it down to the level of the individual. And so to make that story very relatable. And I think that Catherine really managed to achieve that.
Thank you. I mean, I will say that it was also really important to me to narrate the novel from the perspective of the young adult characters, Miranda, and give this young woman agency in the novel, and try and internalize her particular experience of changing weather, more unpredictable winds and storms, or new birds appearing on the island, or, thunderstorms for the first time, with, the sort of pulse of other changes that a young woman goes through, her sexuality, and just, even menstruation, and just have all these different beats of change occurring, the big catastrophic changes of a hurricane and strangers appearing on your doorstep, and then these slower incremental changes, and just think about how we respond to change as individuals was really important to me. And also to think about, the climate crisis as an intergenerational conversation, and how do we talk about it in families? How do we talk about it, parents and children? And I don't have children, but I mean, I'm the one who's asking my sisters, like, how do you talk about climate change with your kids?
I think it's systemic. It's not, there's no one radical change. I think that we have to radically change the way we use energy, of course, because energy is at the core of the problem of climate change. And that also gives me hope because, as we were saying before, it's not, while I agree, we absolutely have to change our relationship to nature. I think when you talk about with people, you talk about the fact that it's an energy problem and we need to, be more efficient in the way we use energy, but also that there are all kinds of ways that we can deliver energy services to our buildings and the way we get around, and we can do that with cleaner energy sources. And so it's a more positive story, I think, than asking people or suggesting that the transition has to be that they absolutely totally change everything that they're doing and go back to living, extremely simple ways of life. And while we should all do a little bit more of that, I think, climate change or taking action on climate change doesn't mean that we have to fundamentally stop doing all the things we're doing. We have to do them differently, and we have to fuel, all that activity with clean energy sources.
I would just add, to Elizabeth's, picture that I think I'm a little more of an anti-capitalist, and I just think that, we do collectively, the cultural narratives of growth, and they are, profound cultural narratives of endless growth, and that we can go on growing, and they have to come to an end somehow. We have to create a greater cultural narrative of sustainability, and of enoughness, and replace growth with care, I think, and this broader notion of kinship, and how we go back to this deep sense of community with others and with the natural world. For me, that has to become part of our central cultural narrative. And so, I'm committed to doing my part.